The day I was trapped in the fire, my husband was outside the delivery room waiting for his first love. I died in that inferno. Nothing remained but ashes. When I woke up again, I was back in high school. Seeing that all too familiar face, the only thing I felt was nausea. Esteban would never know he lost more than just me in that fire. He also lost our unborn child.
Today, it was Esteban's turn to clean the blackboard, but the name written on it was clearly mine, Maria Sanchez. Everyone was used to me covering for him. After all, I had always been completely submissive to him.
Let the show begin, Maria. Carlos tossed the eraser onto my desk, gesturing for me to clean the board for Esteban. With the eraser in hand, I smirked and walked to the blackboard. The girls who always mocked my devotion to Esteban began their usual sarcastic comments. Seriously, she has no shame. She's been doing this for years and he barely looks at her.
I know, right? I heard she's been chasing him since middle school. I'd never stoop that low.
Pathetic. The whispers were endless, but my past self had chosen to ignore them, blinded by a one-sided love that eventually led to my lonely death in that fire. Even reborn, I wouldn't forget the piercing pain of that night. They say you have to hit rock bottom to make a change. Well, I hit rock bottom. It was time to turn the tables. Everyone probably expected me to do what I always did. Clean the blackboard for Esteban, fetch him warm water, basically serve him from head to toe. It was precisely because I had always done everything for Esteban that, 10 years later, he thought of himself as a king. But not today.
I glanced at the girls who mocked me and smiled with fake gratitude.
Thanks for the warning, ladies. What a weirdo! Ignoring their jabs, I erased my name from the board and wrote Esteban's in bold capital letters. No need to switch the name anymore. Class president, sorry for bothering you all this time. The class stared at me, stunned as if I had done something truly shocking. Is she crazy? What's she thinking now? You don't get it. It's reverse psychology. She's playing hard to get, hoping he'll come crawling back. Whatever. I shrugged and looked at the math equations scrawled across the board. As I put down the eraser, I saw Esteban returning from the basketball court. He was undeniably handsome. Standing there at the door, backlit by the light, it was easy to understand why I had fallen for him. But now, looking at his face, all I felt was disgust. The chatty girls suddenly fell silent. The whole class held its breath. Dozens of eyes waited for the show. I brushed the chalk dust off my hands, calmly walked back to my seat, pulled out my chair, and sat down. I didn't look at Esteban even once. He hadn't noticed the blackboard, probably assuming I had already taken care of it. He went straight to his seat and reached for his water bottle. Unfortunately for him, I hadn't filled it today either. His best friend, Zacharias, noticed the blackboard and whispered, "What's up with Senora Benitez writing your name on the board, Esteban?"
Maria didn't clean the board for you, and no water either?
Esteban finally noticed the math equations scribbled across the board. His brow furrowed, but he quickly recovered his usual indifferent expression and rummaged through his desk drawer. Normally, there would be a clean handkerchief and a carton of warm milk waiting for him. But today, there was nothing. Zacharias watched as Esteban came up empty-handed, and with his usual tactlessness said to me, "Maria, what's with the sudden change of heart? No cleaning the board, no milk, no water, what gives?" I frowned at Zacharias, my patience wearing thin. Is he disabled? Can't he do these things himself? I'm not his mother. I have no obligation to take care of him. Esteban's eyes flickered, and he let out a soft, cold snort. He probably thought, like everyone else, that I was just playing a game, waiting for him to persuade me to return. Esteban nudged Zacharias with his foot, signaling him to shut up. Zacharias quickly got up and went to erase the blackboard. I opened my textbook and began studying. Because of Esteban, I had given up the chance to attend the prestigious Northwood High and chose Southwood instead. I could have been in advanced classes here, but because of Esteban, I ended up in the lowest level class. I had argued with my mom about it, but she eventually relented. Our families were close, so it didn't seem to matter where I went to school. The plan had always been for me to go to college with Esteban anyway. Perhaps it was the connection between our families that made me see Esteban as my Prince Charming. Now, the only thing I could think was, what an idiot. He thought he was some kind of royalty. This time, I was going to keep my distance from Esteban, starting with the next seat change. I was determined to make it into the top 10 of the class in the upcoming monthly exams. I never wanted to sit in front of Esteban again. Zacharias returned after erasing the board. Seeing me study, he grabbed my book. Well, Miss Sanchez hitting the books, prepping to be Esteban's tutor again. Maybe you could help me too? In his eyes, everything I did was ultimately to get Esteban's attention. I snatched my book back, my voice tinged with annoyance. A dull brain is a dull brain. No amount of tutoring will fix it. Maybe you should go study abroad or something.
I turned with my book and locked eyes with Esteban. He was angry, of course. In his mind, Maria would never say anything bad about him.
Did I do something to you? His tone was sharp, almost hostile. I ignored him. I walked past him with my book and returned to my seat. Knowing Esteban, he wouldn't ask twice. Sure enough, he kicked the chair next to him and stormed out of the classroom. I shook my head. He really thought he was a king, and it was my fault for having such terrible taste in men. I went to the cafeteria to have lunch alone. Before, I would always follow Esteban, eagerly getting his lunch and drinks. Today, I realized how easy it was to simply get food for myself. No more glaring looks from people waiting in line. So many times, I'd been scolded for trying to grab Esteban's favorite sweet and sour pork, and all I ever got in return was, "I didn't ask you to get my lunch."
You deserve it, I thought to myself. Yeah, I deserve it.
I carried my tray to my usual seat by the window. Before long, I saw Esteban and Zacharias walking into the cafeteria with their basketball. They usually came over to me, but today they hadn't gotten their lunch. Zacharias noticed the single tray in front of me and looked surprised.
Maria's eating alone!
I chewed my food, pointing to the service counter. "There might still be some left if you hurry." Esteban frowned as he looked at me. His ego was hurt, and it was clear he wasn't happy.
Maria, what's going on? What did I do to you?
I kept eating, my head down. Should I tell him that 10 years later, while he was waiting for his first love to give birth to a child that wasn't even his, our unborn child and I died in the fire? Should I tell him how I called him countless times that night only to get a busy signal? Or how he eventually just hung up and texted me saying he was in a meeting in the hospital hallway?
Esteban, did you really think I was that stupid? Did you really think I didn't know anything?
In the end, Esteban didn't eat. He stormed out of the cafeteria furious. He skipped afternoon classes too. That evening, I told my parents that I wouldn't be going to college with Esteban after graduation. "Why?" my mom asked. Looking at their faces, a lump formed in my throat. I was their only daughter. And in my past life, I had been so obsessed with a man who didn't love me in his heart or his eyes that I had neglected the two people who loved me most in the world. And in the end, I made them bury their own daughter, I thought, choking back a sob. "I want to spend more time with you," I told my parents. My dad, always indulgent, supported me whenever I set my mind to something. After that, they found me a tutor, someone a year older than me from Northwood High, who had achieved the highest score in the city on the entrance exam. His name was Antonio Hernandez. Antonio started coming to my house every weekend to tutor me. He was incredibly smart. His explanations were often simpler and clearer than what our teachers taught in class. This weekend was the final game of the high school basketball tournament. Our school was hosting the event. Antonio would be playing as well. He was the captain of Northwood's team. He mentioned he had compiled some notes for me and would bring them to the game. Since the game was on a Friday, Antonio would come to my house afterward for our regular tutoring session. But Esteban was playing too, so I didn't plan to attend the game. Instead, I waited in the classroom for Antonio to message me. I sent him a text. "Good luck, Mr. Hernandez. Take care." Just as I was about to put my phone away, Zacharias snatched it from my hand. "Good luck, Mr. Hernandez. Take care." "Maria, have you moved on already?" Zacharias' loud voice caught Esteban's attention. He turned to me with an unusual expression. For a moment, I thought I saw a flash of nervousness, maybe even fear, in his eyes. Esteban, the ever-arrogant Esteban, showing such vulnerability. He walked over, took the phone from Zacharias, and read the messages. His face darkened, and then he looked at me slowly. His voice, heavy with suspicion, asked, "Who is he?" I grabbed my phone back and stuffed it into my pocket. "Why does it matter to you?" Zacharias gawked, astonished. It was hard to believe those words had come from me. I turned to leave, heading for the library, but before I could take a step, Esteban grabbed my arm. "I asked you, who is he? You're not going anywhere until you tell me." Was he insane? In my past life, I had chased after him relentlessly, enduring the way he treated me like an annoyance, with obvious disdain written all over his face. Now that I was giving him exactly what he wanted, distance, he suddenly clung to me. How pathetic. I shook off his hand and frowned, my voice calm. "Esteban, I thought you hated me, so please keep hating me." But Esteban grabbed my arm again. At that moment, a clear male voice called from the doorway, "Maria!" I turned to the voice and saw Antonio standing at the classroom entrance. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't expected to see him here at Southwood. His dark eyes looked at me with concern, then shifted to Esteban's hand, gripping my arm. "What are you doing here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady as I pulled away from Esteban's grasp. Antonio stepped into the classroom, his presence filling the space. He wore Northwood's navy blue uniform, which contrasted sharply with Southwood's gray. "I came to bring you the notes I promised," he said, holding up a folder. "I thought I'd give them to you before the game."
Esteban stepped between us, his body tense like a guitar string ready to snap.
"And who are you?" he growled, his voice dripping with hostility. The air grew heavy with tension. Zacharias, ever the gossip, let out a snicker.
Well, Maria.
"Is this your new boyfriend?"
"He's my tutor," I replied curtly, ignoring the flicker of satisfaction I felt at seeing the hurt expression on Esteban's face. For a moment, I allowed myself to savor his discomfort. Was this how he felt every time he ignored me in the past?
Antonio, unaware of the history between Esteban and me, extended his hand. "Antonio Hernandez from Northwood High. Nice to meet you."
Esteban ignored the outstretched hand, his eyes blazing with a mixture of jealousy and confusion.
"Tutor? Since when do you need a tutor?" "Since I decided I deserve more than being your shadow," I said, surprised by the firmness in my own voice. The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, as if I had suddenly become a stranger. And maybe I had. The Maria they knew, the one who would have done anything for Esteban, no longer existed. Sensing the tension, Antonio stepped forward. "Maria, if this isn't a good time, I can—" "No!" I interrupted, making a decision in that instant. "It's the perfect time. In fact, why don't we head to the library? We can go over those notes before the game." I saw Esteban's jaw clench, his knuckles whitening as he tightened his fists. For a moment, I thought he might say something, try to stop me. But he just stood there, staring at me as though seeing me for the first time. I grabbed my backpack and walked toward Antonio. As I passed Esteban, our shoulders brushed, and I felt a jolt, an electric mix of the familiarity of 10 years and the bitterness of a life wasted. "Good luck in the game, Esteban," I said without looking at him, my voice soft but loaded with a meaning only I understood. "I hope that this time, when someone needs you, you'll be there for them." I left the classroom with Antonio, leaving behind a stunned silence. As we walked down the hallway, each step felt like I was shedding the Maria I had been and moving closer to the one I wanted to be. "Are you okay?" Antonio asked as we headed toward the library. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of years of unrequited love lift from my shoulders. "Yes," I replied, surprised at how true that simple word felt. "For the first time in a long while, I am." As we entered the library, the scent of old books and new possibilities surrounded me. I glanced at Antonio with his carefully prepared notes, then out the window where I could see the basketball court. A small smile curved my lips. The game was about to begin, but for the first time, it wasn't Esteban's that I cared about. The library was nearly empty, with most students preparing for the big game. Antonio and I sat at a table in a quiet corner, surrounded by shelves full of books that seemed to watch us in silence. "So," Antonio began as he opened his folder, "do you want to talk about what just happened, or would you rather focus on differential equations?" I sighed, running my fingers along the edge of the table. The surface was rough, marked by the scratches of generations of students. I wondered how many stories like mine these tables had witnessed. "Differential equations sound good," I replied with a forced smile. "At least they have clear solutions." Antonio nodded but didn't dive into the lesson right away. Instead, he looked at me with his dark eyes, deep and wise like wells of understanding. "Snap! Maria, we haven't known each other for long, but I can tell something's bothering you. Sometimes talking helps more than any equation." His words hit me like a wave, breaking down the walls I had carefully built around my emotions. Before I knew it, the words were spilling out of me like an overflowing river. "It's Esteban," I began, my voice barely a whisper. "I've known him forever, you know? He was my everything, my sun, my moon, my reason to breathe. How pathetic, right?" Antonio didn't say anything, he just listened. His silence felt like a warm embrace, comforting and safe. "But now," I continued, feeling lighter with every word, "now I see everything so clearly. I see how he used me, how he took me for granted. And the worst part is, I let him. I gave up everything for him, Antonio, my dreams, my ambitions, even myself." My eyes filled with tears, but they weren't from sadness. They were from anger, frustration, and years of suppressed self-love finally breaking free. "And you know what's the funniest part?" I said with a bitter laugh. "Some stupid part of me still loves him. After everything he's done to me, some part of me still wants to run to him and tell him it's all forgiven." Antonio placed his hand on the table, not to touch me, but as a silent gesture of support. Love isn't stupid, Maria. It's what makes us human. But self-love? That's what makes us strong.
His words struck a chord, putting into words something I'd always known deep down but had never dared to acknowledge.
How do I do it? I asked, my voice breaking. How do I let go of 10 years of my life? How do I forgive myself for being so blind? Antonio smiled, a gentle smile that lit up his entire face.
One step at a time, Maria. Start by recognizing your worth. You're smart, strong, and you deserve so much more than you've allowed yourself to have.
At that moment, we heard the roar of the crowd coming from the gymnasium. The game had started. You should go, I told Antonio. You're the captain of your team.
He shook his head.
My team can handle the first quarter without me. Right now, I think I'm exactly where I need to be.
A warmth spread through my chest, a feeling I hadn't experienced in a long time. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was the beginning of something new, something that was mine.
Thank you, I whispered. You're welcome, Antonio replied. Now, how about we tackle those equations? After all, the best revenge is success.
I nodded, wiping away my tears, and opened my notebook. As Antonio began to explain, I realized that this moment, sitting here in the library with someone I barely knew, was the start of my true story. The game continued outside, but for the first time in my life, I didn't care about the outcome. I had my own battles to fight, and this time I was determined to emerge victorious. Hours flew by as Antonio and I delved into a sea of numbers and formulas. His explanations made even the most complex concepts seem simple, like puzzle pieces falling into place. For the first time in ages, I felt my mind expand, challenged and stimulated in a way I had forgotten was possible. Suddenly, a deafening roar shook the library. Cheers and shouts from the gymnasium seeped through the walls, signaling the game's end.
Sounds like it was an exciting match, Antonio remarked, closing his notebook.
I nodded absent-mindedly, surprised that a part of me still wondered how Esteban had fared. Shaking my head, I pushed the thought aside. Maybe we should go see, I suggested, more out of habit than genuine interest. As we walked toward the gym, the hallway buzzed with euphoric students.
The air was electric, charged with excitement and celebration. But something felt off. The faces around us weren't those of victory. They were filled with shock and confusion.
What could have happened? I murmured, more to myself than to Antonio. Then I saw him. Esteban was sitting on a bench outside the gym, his head in his hands. His basketball uniform was soaked with sweat, and his body trembled slightly.
Zacharias was beside him, speaking in a low, frantic tone.
Without thinking, my feet carried me toward him. As I got closer, fragments of their conversation reached me.
I can't believe you did that, man, Zacharias said, his voice full of frustration. Throwing the game like that? What were you thinking?
My heart skipped a beat. Esteban had thrown the game. The same Esteban who lived and breathed basketball. Esteban, I said softly, surprised by the concern in my own voice. He looked up, his eyes red and swollen. For a moment, I saw the boy who had once been my best friend, vulnerable and lost. Maria, he whispered, his voice hoarse, I messed everything up.
I felt a hand on my shoulder and turned to see Antonio standing behind me, his expression a mix of concern and confusion.
What happened? I asked, directing the question to no one in particular.
It was Zacharias who answered, his voice heavy with frustration and disappointment.
Esteban lost his head in the last quarter.
He started passing the ball to the opposing team, missing shots on purpose. We lost by 20 points.
I stared at Esteban, unable to believe what I was hearing. This wasn't the Esteban I knew, the one who would sacrifice everything for a victory.
Why? I asked, my voice barely a whisper.
Esteban lifted his gaze, his eyes meeting mine. Because nothing matters if you're not there, he said simply. It felt like the ground opened beneath me. All the emotions I had tried to bury for weeks surged forward. Rage, pain, confusion, and yes, love. That cursed love that refused to die. No, I said, my voice trembling. You don't have the right to do this. Esteban, you can't ruin your future and blame me for it. Antonio stepped forward, his presence an anchor amidst the storm of emotions. I think everyone needs a moment to calm down, he said, his voice calm but firm. But Esteban stood up, his eyes blazing with an intensity that scared me. Who are you to get involved in this? He growled. This is between Maria and me. You're wrong, I said, surprised by the firmness in my voice. This is about you, Esteban, about your decisions, your actions. You can't keep blaming others for your mistakes. I saw the pain in his eyes, but there was something else too, recognition.
For the first time, Esteban was truly seeing me, not as the girl who would always be there for him, but as a person with her own desires and needs. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words sounding like they physically hurt to say. "For everything." I felt tears prickling my eyes but held them back.
"I'm sorry too, Esteban," I said quietly. "I'm sorry it's come to this." With that, I turned and walked away, feeling the weight of years of shared history between us. Antonio followed silently, his presence a comforting reassurance.
As we stepped outside, the cool night air hit me, carrying away some of the heaviness of the moment. I looked at Antonio, grateful for his quiet support. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. I took a deep breath, feeling something inside me break and mend all at once. "No," I replied honestly, "but I think I will be."
As we walked toward my house, I realized this day had marked a turning point. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was in control of my own destiny. The night was young and my story was just beginning.
That night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, replaying the events of the day over and over in my mind. Esteban's devastated face, Antonio's kind words, the whirlwind of emotions coursing through me. Everything spun in my head like a carousel gone mad. When the sun began peeking through my window, I got up, exhausted but determined. It was Saturday, the day of my tutoring session with Antonio. Part of me wanted to cancel, to hide under the covers and pretend the outside world didn't exist. But another part, a part that was growing stronger every day, pushed me to face whatever came next. I got dressed mechanically and went downstairs for breakfast. My parents were already in the kitchen, and from their expressions, I knew the news about the game had spread.
"Honey," my mom began, her voice full of concern. "Are you okay? We heard about what happened last night with Esteban."
I took a deep breath. "I'm fine, Mom. Really."
My dad looked at me over the top of his newspaper, his eyes scanning my face.
"Are you sure? You know you can talk to us about anything, right?"
A wave of gratitude washed over me. In my previous life, I had neglected them so much in my obsession with Esteban. This time, I promised myself it would be different. "I know, Dad, and I will, I promise, but right now, I need to process all this on my own." Just then, the doorbell rang. Antonio had arrived for our session. "That must be my tutor," I said, standing up. "We'll be in the living room, okay?" My parents nodded, exchanging a look I couldn't quite decipher. I opened the door, and there was Antonio, his usual warm smile in place, a stack of books under his arm. But today, there was something different in his gaze, a mix of concern and... was that determination? "Good morning, Maria," he said softly. "How are you?"
"I've been better," I admitted, stepping aside to let him in. "But I'm ready to study."
We settled in the living room, surrounded by books and papers. As Antonio began explaining a particularly complex problem, I realized I couldn't focus. My mind kept drifting back to the previous night, to Esteban's lost expression, to the words we had exchanged. "Maria," Antonio's voice pulled me out of my thoughts. "You don't have to pretend everything is okay. If you need to talk..." And suddenly, as if his words had opened a floodgate, it all came spilling out. I told him everything, my history with Esteban, how I had given up everything for him, how I felt betrayed and lost. Antonio listened in silence, his eyes never leaving mine. When I finished, exhausted and with tears in my eyes, he gently took my hand. "Maria," he said, his voice filled with an emotion I couldn't quite place. "You are one of the strongest people I've ever met. You've been through so much, and yet here you are, fighting to be better. That's admirable." His words warmed me from the inside like sunlight breaking through after a storm. But then Antonio continued, and what he said next changed everything. "There's something I need to tell you," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "Last night, after I dropped you off at home, I went back to the school. I wanted to talk to the coach about the game, and I overheard something about Esteban and Zacharias." My heart began to race. "What did you hear?" Antonio took a deep breath.
"They're involved in an academic fraud scheme, Maria. They've been altering grades, not just their own, but other students as well, for money."
The world seemed to stop. It felt like the ground was crumbling beneath my feet. Esteban, my Esteban, a cheater, a scammer? "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "It can't be. There must be a mistake." But deep down, a part of me knew it was true. It explained so much. Esteban's surprisingly good grades despite never studying, the way he always seemed to have extra cash. "I'm sorry, Maria," Antonio said, squeezing my hand. "I know this is hard to hear, but I thought you needed to know." I stayed silent for what felt like an eternity, trying to process this new information. Then something inside me hardened. A cold, clear resolve formed in my mind.
Thank you for telling me, Antonio, I said finally, my voice steadier than I had expected. Now I know exactly what I need to do.
Antonio looked at me, a mix of concern and admiration in his eyes. What are you going to do?
I stood up, feeling a new energy coursing through my veins. I'm going to do the right thing, and in the process, I'm going to take my life back.
At that moment, looking into Antonio's worried gaze, I knew my real story was just beginning, and this time, I would be the author of my own destiny. Monday arrived with a sense of inevitability. The weekend had passed in a blur of planning and determination. Antonio had been by my side, offering support and advice, but the final decision was mine, and I was ready to make it. I walked into the school with my head held high, ignoring the stares and whispers that followed me. The scandal of Friday's game was still fresh in everyone's minds, but soon they would have something else to talk about. I spotted Esteban at his locker, surrounded as always by his entourage of admirers. Our eyes met for a brief moment, and I saw a flicker of something. Guilt? Regret? Before he quickly looked away. Zacharias was beside him, speaking in a low, frantic tone. When he noticed me, he suddenly fell silent, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. Maria, Esteban said, his voice tense. Can we talk? I felt a pang in my chest. A part of me, the part that still loved him, wanted to give in, wanted to believe that everything could go back to how it was before. But the Maria he knew no longer existed. I'm sorry, Esteban, I said firmly. I have things to do. Without waiting for his response, I walked toward the principal's office. Each step felt like I was walking toward my own judgment, but I knew it was the right thing to do. The secretary looked surprised when I asked to speak with Principal Ramirez. It's urgent, I insisted. Minutes later, I was seated across from him, a middle-aged man with kind but weary eyes. What can I do for you, Maria? He asked, his voice full of curiosity. I took a deep breath. Principal, I have information about an academic fraud scheme at the school. His eyes widened. That's a very serious accusation, Maria. Are you sure? I nodded, feeling the weight of my words. Completely sure, sir. And I have evidence. I pulled a folder from my backpack. Over the weekend, Antonio and I had gathered all the evidence we could find. Emails, text messages, even bank transaction records showing suspicious payments. Principal Ramirez flipped through the documents, his expression growing darker with each page. This is very serious, Maria. Do you understand the implications? Yes, sir, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I do. Who is involved? He asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. Esteban Benitez and Zacharias Morales, I replied, the words burning in my throat, and possibly others. The principal removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. Maria, I must thank you for your honesty and bravery, but I have to ask, why now? Why are you coming to me with this? I felt tears sting my eyes, but held them back. Because it's the right thing to do, sir. Because I've spent too long letting bad things happen around me without doing anything about it. Because I want to be someone I can be proud of. Principal Ramirez looked at me for a long moment, as if truly seeing me for the first time. Finally, he nodded. I understand. Thank you, Maria. I promise we'll investigate this thoroughly. In the meantime, I ask for your discretion. This could have serious consequences for many people. I left his office feeling both lighter and heavier. I had done the right thing, I knew that, but it didn't make it hurt any less. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I went to my classes, took notes, answered questions, all on autopilot. I could feel Esteban and Zacharias' eyes on me, but I refused to meet their gaze. When the final bell rang, I hurried out of the building. Antonio was waiting for me at the entrance, his face full of concern. How did it go? He asked softly. It's done, I replied, my voice trembling. For better or worse? It's done. Antonio pulled me into a hug, and for the first time all day, I allowed myself to cry. I cried for the love I had lost, for the years I had wasted, for the innocence I would never regain. But as I cried, something else grew inside me. Strength, determination, hope. Come on, Antonio said when I finally pulled away. Let me buy you a coffee. I think you need it. As we walked together, I felt like I was taking the first steps toward a new chapter in my life. One where I was in control, one where I could be the heroine of my own story. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions and events. Principal Ramirez's investigation moved quickly, and soon the entire school was in chaos. Esteban and Zacharias were suspended pending a disciplinary hearing, and several other students were called in for questioning. I stayed on the sidelines, trying not to draw attention to myself, but it was impossible to completely escape the stares and whispers.
Some saw me as a heroine, others saw me as a traitor. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in between.
One afternoon, as I was leaving my last class, I came face to face with Esteban. He was alone, without his usual entourage of admirers. He looked haggard, with dark circles under his eyes and unkempt hair.
Maria, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Can we talk? Please.
A part of me wanted to run to avoid this conversation at all costs, but I knew we would have to face this sooner or later. All right, I replied, guiding him to an empty bench in the courtyard. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of years of history pressing down on us. It was you, wasn't it? He finally asked. You told the principal about everything. I nodded, unable to trust my voice to speak.
Esteban let out a shaky sigh.
Why?
Because it was the right thing to do, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. Because I couldn't keep being complicit in your lies, Esteban. Because I deserve more than that. We all do. I saw tears forming in his eyes. I'm so sorry, Maria, for everything, for taking you for granted, for not valuing you the way I should have, for being a coward and a cheat. His words hit me like a punch in the stomach. For so long, I had dreamed of hearing Esteban apologize, of him owning up to his mistakes. But now that it was finally happening, I felt empty. I'm sorry too, Esteban, I said softly. I'm sorry I let things go this far. I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough to confront you sooner. We sat in silence for a moment, letting the weight of our words settle between us. What happens now? Esteban asked finally. I shrugged. I don't know. I guess we'll all have to face the consequences of our actions. Esteban nodded slowly.
I guess so. I'm going to confess everything, Maria. To the school board, to my parents, to everyone. It's the least I can do. I felt a surge of respect for him. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a trace of the Esteban I had once loved. I'm glad, I said sincerely. That's a good first step. We stood, and for a moment we looked into each other's eyes. I saw pain there, and regret, but I also saw a glimmer of something else. Hope, perhaps?
Goodbye, Esteban, I said softly.
Goodbye, Maria, he replied. And thank you for everything. I watched him walk away, his shoulders slumped, but his head held high. I felt a pang of nostalgia, but also a sense of closure. And that night, as I got ready for bed, I received a message from Antonio. How are you? Do you want to talk? I smiled, feeling warmth spread through my chest. I'm okay, I replied. In fact, I think I'm better than ever. And it was true. For the first time in a long while, I felt at peace with myself. I had faced my demons. I had done the right thing, even though it was hard. The future was still uncertain. The investigation was ongoing, and I knew there would be more challenges ahead. But I was no longer afraid. I had found my strength, my voice, my courage. I looked out the window at the stars shining in the night sky. Somewhere out there, I felt as if my future self, the one who had died in that fire, was smiling at me with approval. We did it, I whispered to the night. We changed our story. And as I drifted off to sleep, I dreamed of new beginnings, of second chances, of a future full of possibilities. My story wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. And this time, I would be the author of every page.